Honestly, I think the Trade Machine series is probably one of, if not the best thing that I've ever done on this channel. It gets you guys involved. It's great videos for me to make. I really enjoy them, and they always do really well, so I'm really thankful for this series. Anyway, welcome back, everybody. My name is Tucker, and in today's video, we're going to be doing an NBA Trade Machine episode on the Boston Celtics. And some people were a little bit confused when I tweeted this out. And the reason that I want to do a trade machine on the Celtics is because I feel like there's some interesting moves for them to potentially make this offseason, which I talked about in their What's Next video. And they have the opportunity to shift their roster in really specific ways to potentially make themselves even more of a contender for next year than I think they've already established themselves as with their conference finals and nearly a finals run this year. They have some clear holes on this roster and plenty of assets to make moves to fill those holes as a result of 3 first-round picks this year and some big expiring contracts on the roster as well. So an interesting team to take a look at, and that is why we're doing a trade machine on them today. But really quickly before we get started, if you enjoy content like this, then consider subscribing. I upload basically every single day. Most of the time, it's like 5 to 6 times a week. And leaving a like rating is a great way to let me know that you're enjoying the content, and it helps out the video a ton as well. And if you like this trade machine content, we've been talking about possible trades and trade machine stuff all week long over on my Twitch channel. You can come over there and talk about basketball or whatever's going on at the moment. It's been super fun seeing the growth and the momentum that we're building over there on a different platform. So if you want to, it's twitch.tv/spolo_TD, and it's pretty likely that I'm live right now. So come hang out. Okay, so we're going to start off with a trade from Alex. And in this trade, the Celtics received Jrue Holiday in exchange for Gordon Hayward, Romeo Langford, and 2 first-round picks. In this case, it is the Celtics' own pick and the Milwaukee pick, both of which are pretty late in the first round. And this is a trade package that you're going to see a few times throughout this trade machine video, at least in some variation. The Gordon Hayward contract is involved in a lot of these deals, and it's just because of the large expiring contract number that he has. And then Romeo Langford is a pretty solid player as well that the Celtics do like, but I think holds a good amount of value around the league as a younger player that could potentially turn into a nice kind of 3-and-D wing type player. Then you've got the 2 extra first-round picks as well. Interestingly, though, in this particular deal, the Celtics keep the highest draft pick that they have in this draft, which is number 14, which is the Memphis pick. And they're getting a player in Jrue Holiday that I think works really well with their roster, and a player that I think holds a good amount of value, but I'm unsure at what point, if at all, the Pelicans are going to consider trading him for even more young assets when they already have so many picks on this roster. But specifically with the fit for Boston, Holiday can defend, he can score, he can shoot, he can play on or off the ball as either the lead guard on the floor or as a secondary playmaker. It fits really well, honestly, within any roster. So I think depending on where you're coming from and what the goals of each of these teams are, I think this is an acceptable trade on both sides and potentially a pretty valuable one either way as well. Moving on now to a trade that I came up with, and this is one that I know we've talked about before. I can't remember if it was in the Buddy Hield trade machine or in a Celtics video or on stream. I can't remember where we talked about this, but it's Buddy Hield in exchange for Gordon Hayward plus some amount of assets, whether it's Romeo Langford, whether it's picks, whether it's whatever. In this scenario, it's the 14th pick from Memphis and the Milwaukee pick as well, and then the Celtics would be keeping their own. Here's the mindset here. For the Kings, the Buddy Hield thing is obviously not working out all that well. He's unhappy. He doesn't like Luke Walton as a coach. He is just unhappy with the organization. He's unhappy with being benched, and he probably wants to go somewhere else. And that makes him one of the more interesting trade candidates on the market because as one of the best shooters in the league, if you already have pieces around this guy, he can be a really effective player, and certainly the Celtics have the pieces around him to make this a good fit. Now, the money that he's making over the next couple of years is at least a little bit questionable when you're considering a limited, let's just say, defensive skill set. But still, if you're looking specifically at the Celtics, I think that's an interesting fit. And they're giving up Hayward, who again is going to be involved in a lot of these, and 2 first-round picks. And basically, you're just saying we like the spacing of Hield, we like the offensive game of Hield more than kind of a bit more of an all-around game of Gordon Hayward. And I think that's not a bad thing to take a look at all when you're looking at improving this roster. Raising the offensive ceiling, having another playmaker, having another really good shooter on the floor. And really the 2 first-round picks aren't a huge deal to the Celtics because they already have 3 selections in this draft and they're unlikely to use all 3. It sucks that they're giving up a pick so high, but when you're looking at a player of Hield's caliber, maybe that is something that would potentially be worth it for the Celtics to give up in exchange for Hield. So you never really know, obviously, how these things would potentially work out on either side. Maybe this is too much, maybe this isn't enough. For me, I feel like this is at least close to a nice little middle ground because Hield, I think, is certainly a better player than Hayward, and Hayward obviously has had issues staying on the floor. And this would be a really cool fit. While for the Kings, I mean, they're getting future assets and they're choosing between Hield and Bogdanovich, and then at a certain extent as well, De'Aaron Fox, and they're getting a player out of the organization that simply doesn't want to be there, and that isn't necessarily a bad thing. So certainly an interesting deal to take a look at. I think that one that works pretty well for both sides. Next up now, Seth sent me a trade where he says that the Celtics would receive Nikola Vucevic in exchange for Gordon Hayward, 2 second-round picks, and that first-round pick from Memphis that we just talked about. So again, you can kind of work your way around the, which picks you do or don't want to give up in this scenario. The Celtics certainly have plenty at their disposal. When you're looking at this directly next to the Hield trade, maybe you're thinking that, the Celtics need to be giving up more here because Vucevic is a better player than Buddy Hield, a guy that's been an all-star. But regardless, we're not going to have to, get into all the extra who needs this pick and that pick. Let's talk about specifically the fit for both of these teams. So for Orlando, this is a bit of a reset move. Obviously, Jonathan Isaac is unlikely to play next year given his knee injury, given the timeline of next season, assuming it starts at least relatively on time. And that's going to make it really tough for Orlando to do much of anything next year in terms of improving their standing within the Eastern Conference above what they've been, which has been, a 7 or an 8 seed. So at that point, maybe you look at the situation, you think, it's time for us to not necessarily rebuild, but maybe reset some things here. Maybe try and get someone like Mo Bamba more minutes at the 5 spot. Maybe make Aaron Gordon a little bit more comfortable playing the 4, potentially even small ball 5 at times, and get some value out of a player in Vucevic that's really good, but maybe isn't helping them a ton over the next couple of years, given the situation that they're in currently. And for Boston, the hole on this roster is pretty clearly the 5 spot at this point when you're starting Daniel Tice, who's been a good player and a good defender, but certainly doesn't have the same kind of offensive impact, not nearly the same kind of offensive impact that someone like Nikola Vucevic does. And from an offensive standpoint, this would be a huge upgrade at that 5 spot for Boston. They're of course getting rid of Hayward, but they have the wings to fill that part of their roster. And you're looking at a really good 5-man group. Now defensively, Vucevic would certainly have to be better and improve, and I think Brad Stevens would find a way to make it work with him at the 5 spot. We'd kind of have to wait and see how that works in the postseason, but still, I think this would be a really interesting fit specifically for Boston and for Orlando. Maybe you have to talk yourself into it a little bit more than you typically would, but I think it's at least an interesting package, and you can kind of mess with the picks and stuff, and Boston certainly has the assets to potentially get this done. Vucevic is a player that they really want. Next up now is a trade that I came up with, and it is LaMarcus Aldridge and Trey Lyles going to Boston in exchange for Hayward and 2 first-round picks. The Aldridge thing was something that just kind of came to me as I was looking at possible trades for Boston, because you're looking at bigs, you're looking at 4s and 5s that could potentially help this team, and Aldridge just kind of came to mind, and I thought, you know what if the Spurs really did want to kind of reset this thing a little bit and try and get some assets? And obviously the expiring contract of Hayward doesn't really help them because both the players they're giving up are on expiring deals as well. But they're getting those 2 first-round picks, and I apologize if maybe it seems like we're just going over the same trade package for Boston over and over, but that's what it's going to look like for the most part, and then you're just kind of looking at the fit potentially for each team. So for Boston, Aldridge in a similar manner to Vucevic, defensively it's going to be a bit of an issue with him at the 5, but they have the other athletes and the players in this roster between Tatum, Brown, and Smart to really make up for a lot of mistakes potentially defensively at the 5 spot. They can hide him a bit in zones, and offensively he's going to be an extremely effective player when healthy for Boston, and someone that I certainly think that they should try and take a look at. And you don't know exactly what San Antonio wants to do moving forward with this roster, but if they are interested in a potential reset, rebuild type situation, if Popovich, leaves this offseason and decides to retire, I think LaMarcus Aldridge is an interesting player to take a look at on the trade market as a potential upcoming free agent, and someone that still holds a good amount of value. Not a huge amount of value given his age and things like that, and maybe in this scenario you take off one of the picks for Boston. Again, I'm not really interested in going back and forth on 1 pick or 3 picks or a second round or a first round or whatever. It's more about the fit. It's more about how you can help Boston out here as well as get some assets to some other teams. And I think this would be a really interesting one for them to take a look at. Next up now, Felix sent a 3-team deal in which the Nets receive Victor Oladipo and Grant Williams, the Celtics receive Jared Allen, and the Pacers receive Karis LeVert and a first-round pick from Boston. And there's a couple of interesting things here. Karis LeVert originally, I believe, would have gone to Indiana, assuming that they'd actually made that selection. It was originally Indiana's pick, I believe. The Nets got in exchange for Thaddeus Young. I don't know all of the details there, but I'm pretty confident that's the case, which is kind of like an interesting little wrinkle here. So for Boston, they're trying to get their 5-man. They're trying to get Jared Allen, who I think can be a really good player, is a pretty solid player right now as a starting 5. Certainly as a rim protector, needs to get stronger, needs to be better offensively, but a really interesting fit within that Celtics group. And so they're getting their 5-man here that they've been kind of looking for. The Nets are getting Victor Oladipo and Grant Williams in exchange for Allen and LeVert, 2 important players for them, but this does, if you're interested in this, open up a spot at the 5 spot for DeAndre Jordan to be the starting 5, which caused some disagreement within the team last year, which I think was pretty stupid. But if that's something you want to do, you can certainly trade away Jarrett Allen and put DeAndre Jordan as the full-time 5. And then you've got Grant Williams as well, that played some interesting 5 minutes for Boston in the postseason. And the Nets would certainly need to find some extra depth behind just DeAndre Jordan at the 5 spot if they did trade away Jarrett Allen. But then, of course, they're getting Oladipo as well to add a little bit of star power to the Kyrie KD thing, which is certainly interesting because Oladipo is, at least when healthy, a pretty good two-way player, which fits nicely with those guys as well. For Indiana, they're getting rid of Oladipo, who may or may not want to be there at this point. It's kind of unclear. And you're getting Karis LeVert, who I think is a really good player and a first-round pick. That's good value there if you're Indiana. My problem with this deal is just the teams involved in it. When healthy, the Nets and Celtics are supposed to be two of the better teams in the Eastern Conference next year. And in a normal schedule year, they play each other 4 times a year. It's pretty unlikely and unforeseen that both of those teams make a deal for each other involving pieces as significant as this. Like, I don't see the Nets trading away Jarrett Allen to a team that could potentially be a team that they meet in the 2nd or the 3rd round of the playoffs if things go well for either of those teams. So that's really kind of my issue here from an asset standpoint, though. I think a good amount of this makes sense, except for the Nets getting rid of Jarrett Allen because of the issues that would create at the 5 spot. But I do like the Oladipo fit, so it's certainly an interesting one. Last up, we've got one that I came up with that I was just kind of having some fun with, to be completely honest. The Celtics receive Rudy Gobert in exchange for Gordon Hayward and Romeo Langford. And this is a scenario in which Utah looks at this and thinks, you know what, I really don't want to pay Rudy Gobert the enormous contract that he's at least going to be able to accept. Whether, the Jazz actually offered to him is kind of irrelevant at this point, but he would be able to accept, and he's going to be a huge expense on this roster over the next handful of years whenever he does get re-signed. And maybe they're looking at it like, you know what, I'm not all that interested in it. And the Celtics kind of hop on that opportunity and say, man, our team and our defense specifically would be crazy if we had Rudy Gobert on the roster. If you're looking at Kemba, Marcus Smart, Jaylen Brown, Jason Tatum, and Rudy Gobert on the floor at the same time, it'd be really difficult to score in that Celtics team. And I know that there's some issues for Gobert at times in ball screen situations and things like that, but his ability to defend the rim along with the perimeter defense of Brown, Tatum, and Smart would be a really, really interesting combination. And of course, they're giving up Gordon Hayward and Romeo Langford here. Again, I'm just kind of having fun with this one. This is the least realistic trade in the entire trade machine, in my opinion, but I just thought it was kind of interesting to think about what it would be like if Boston had if Boston had Rudy Gobert. And of course, Gordon Hayward is going back to Utah in this scenario. They're getting out of having to pay Gobert. And I think Romeo Langford could be a nice wing player moving forward as well. So at least an interesting deal for both these teams to take a look at. And yeah, there you have it. That is going to be the end of today's video, and I thank you all very much for watching. Once again, my name is Tucker. If you missed any of my previous videos, then be sure to check out the boxes on screen. Thanks again, and I'll see you all next time.